Richard Harrison had spent 30 years building an empire. He owned hotels across 3 continents, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and had everything money could buy. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. And on a cold November evening, he was about to discover that sometimes the greatest wealth comes from the most unexpected places. What he witnessed that night would shatter everything he thought he knew about worth, dignity, and love. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Harrison estate as Richard stood in his study, staring at the financial reports that no longer brought him any joy. At 58 years old, he had achieved more than he'd ever dreamed possible. But success, he'd learned, was a hollow companion when you watched your child suffer. His daughter, Charlotte, was 17, beautiful, intelligent, and trapped in a wheelchair since the accident 3 years ago. The drunk driver who'd crashed into their family car had walked away with minor injuries. Charlotte had lost the use of her legs forever, and with them, she lost something even more precious. Her smile, her hope, her belief that life could still hold joy. Richard had hired the best doctors, the finest therapists, built her a room with every accommodation she could possibly need. He'd bought her gifts, enrolled her in online schools with the best teachers, surrounded her with everything money could provide. But nothing worked. Charlotte barely spoke anymore. She spent her days staring out the window at a world she no longer felt part of, a world that had moved on without her. Tonight was the annual charity gala Richard hosted at his estate. 200 of the city's wealthiest individuals would gather in his ballroom, writing checks that would fund hospitals and research centers. It was important work, Richard told himself. But year after year, it felt more like an obligation than a passion. Another performance in a life full of them. Charlotte had refused to attend, as she did every year. She didn't want people's pitying looks, their awkward attempts at conversation, their whispered comments when they thought she couldn't hear. Richard couldn't blame her. He'd tried to convince her, tried to tell her that hiding away wasn't living, but his words rang hollow even to his own ears. What did he know about her pain? He could walk away from any situation he didn't like. She couldn't walk at all. The guests began arriving at 7. Designer gowns, tailored suits, practiced smiles. Richard greeted them with the charm he perfected over decades of networking, but his mind was elsewhere. Upstairs in her room, Charlotte sat alone. Again, always alone. The evening progressed as it always did. Speeches, champagne, the orchestra playing background music, while people discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes. Richard found himself going through the motions, counting down the hours until he could retreat back to his study, back to the isolation that had become his comfort zone. Then, around 9 o'clock, something unusual happened. Richard's head of security, Marcus, approached him with a concerned expression. "Sir, we have a situation. There's a young man at the service entrance. Says he's here to see Charlotte." Richard's protective instincts flared immediately. "Who is he? How does he know my daughter?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "He won't give his name. Says Charlotte knows him from the park. He's not exactly dressed for the occasion, sir." Richard felt anger rising in his chest. Some opportunist had probably seen Charlotte in the park with her nurse, thought he could take advantage of a vulnerable young woman from a wealthy family. Call the police. Have him removed. But as Marcus turned to leave, Richard heard something that stopped him cold. Music, not the bland orchestral arrangements from the ballroom, but something else, something raw and real, drifting from somewhere in the house. And then, impossibly, he heard laughter. Charlotte's laughter. A sound he hadn't heard in 3 years. Richard moved quickly through the hallways, following the sound. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't have said whether from fear or hope. He reached Charlotte's room and stopped at the partially open door, frozen by what he saw inside. A young man, perhaps 19 or 20, stood beside Charlotte's wheelchair. He was thin, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days. His shoes wore at the heels, his jacket patched at the elbows. In his hands was an old portable speaker, playing music, but that wasn't what held Richard's attention. Charlotte was smiling, actually smiling, her face radiant in a way Richard had almost forgotten. And as he watched, the young man extended his hand to her. "Come on, Charlie," the boy said, his voice gentle and warm. "You promised you'd dance with me if I came to your fancy house." Richard wanted to interrupt, wanted to demand answers, but something kept him silent. He watched as Charlotte, with visible effort and determination he hadn't seen from her in years, used the armrest of her wheelchair to shift her weight. The young man moved closer, carefully positioning himself, and then, with infinite tenderness, he lifted her from the chair. Richard nearly stepped in, nearly shouted, but Charlotte's arms were around the boy's neck, and she was laughing again, and the boy was moving, swaying gently to the music, holding Charlotte as if she weighed nothing, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You came," Charlotte whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I didn't think you'd really come." "I told you I would," the boy replied. "I always keep my promises to you." They moved together in a slow circle, the boy supporting Charlotte's weight completely, moving with a grace that suggested he'd done this before, many times before. And Charlotte was transformed. Her head rested on his shoulder, her eyes closed, expression of pure peace on her face. Richard's hands trembled. Who was this boy? How long had he known Charlotte? And why had she never mentioned him? "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here," the boy was saying. "The bus doesn't run as late as it used to, and I had to walk the last 3 miles. But I made it. I wasn't going to miss dancing with you." "You walked 3 miles in the rain?" Charlotte pulled back slightly to look at him. "James, you're soaked." "Worth it," the boy said simply, spinning her gently. "Besides, you're worth walking 100 miles in the rain for." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. The casual affection in the boy's voice, the absolute certainty, the way he looked at Charlotte as if she were perfect exactly as she was. This wasn't some gold digger or opportunist. This was someone who genuinely cared about his daughter. The music changed to something slower, and James adjusted his hold on Charlotte, keeping her secure while still making her feel as if she were truly dancing. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked her. Charlotte laughed. "You mean when you literally ran into my wheelchair and knocked over all those books from the library?" "Hey, in my defense, I was running from my boss at the construction site. He was yelling about me taking an extra 2 minutes on my lunch break." James grinned. "Best 2 minutes I ever took, though, led me right to you." Richard's mind was reeling. Construction site? Library? Charlotte had been going to the library? How had he not known this? "You helped me pick up every single book," Charlotte said softly. "Even though you said your boss was going to dock your pay. You made me laugh that day. It was the first time I'd laughed since the accident." "You have the best laugh in the world," James told her. "I knew right then I wanted to hear it every single day." "But you didn't have time for every day," Charlotte reminded him. "You were working 3 jobs. 2 jobs now," James said, and there was pride in his voice. "I quit the overnight warehouse shift. It was killing me, and I wanted more time to see you. We've been meeting at the park every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 months now. Best part of my week." 6 months. Richard sagged against the doorframe. His daughter had been meeting this boy for 6 months, and he'd had no idea. While he'd been consumed with business meetings and charity galas, Charlotte had built a whole secret world, a world that had brought back her smile. "Tell me again about your dream," Charlotte said, and Richard heard such warmth in her voice that it hurt. James hesitated. "Charlie, you know that's just a dream. It's never going to happen." "Tell me anyway." The boy sighed, but he was smiling. "Okay, one day I'm going to save enough money to go to school. Not a fancy college, just a community college to start. I want to study physical therapy. I want to help people like you, people who've been told they can't do things. I want to show them what's possible." He spun her again, carefully. "And maybe if I'm really lucky, I'll have a small practice somewhere. Nothing fancy, just a place where people feel safe and believed in." "You'll do it," Charlotte said with absolute conviction. "I know you will." "That's 5 years away at least," James said quietly. "Maybe 10. I make $12 an hour at the garage, 14 at the restaurant. After rent and food and helping my mom with her medical bills, I can save maybe $50 a month. Do the math, Charlie. I'm not going anywhere for a long time. Charlotte's arms tightened around his neck. You're already somewhere. You're here. You're real. You're the only person who doesn't treat me like I'm broken. That's because you're not broken, James said fiercely. You're perfect. You're the smartest, funniest, most beautiful person I've ever met. The wheelchair doesn't change any of that. Richard had to turn away for a moment, overcome. This poor boy, this young man who had nothing, who worked 2 jobs and walked 3 miles in rain, saw his daughter more clearly than Richard himself had in 3 years. While Richard had been trying to fix Charlotte with money and things, James had simply loved her, completely, unconditionally, exactly as she was. When Richard looked back, the music had stopped. James was carefully settling Charlotte back into her wheelchair, making sure she was comfortable, brushing her hair back from her face with a tenderness that spoke of deep affection. I should go, James said reluctantly. I don't want your dad's security to actually call the cops on me. Stay, Charlotte pleaded. Just a little longer. Charlie, look at me. Look at this place. I don't belong here. Your father would lose his mind if he knew some poor kid from the South Side was hanging around his daughter. I don't care what he thinks, Charlotte said, but there was sadness in her voice. Why does it matter how much money you have? Why does that change anything? It doesn't change how I feel about you, James said. Nothing could change that, but the world doesn't work like that. Your father's going to want you to be with someone from your world, someone who can give you the life you deserve. You give me something better than money, Charlotte whispered. You give me hope. Richard couldn't stay silent any longer. He pushed open the door fully and stepped into the room. Both Charlotte and James whirled around, Charlotte's face draining of color, James's expression shifting to something between defiance and fear. Dad, Charlotte said, her voice shaking. I can explain. But Richard wasn't looking at Charlotte. He was looking at James, this young man who stood protectively in front of Charlotte's wheelchair despite clearly being terrified. This boy who worked 2 jobs and saved $50 a month and still somehow found the strength to walk 3 miles in the rain to keep a promise. What's your last name? Richard asked, his voice rougher than he intended. James lifted his chin. Cooper, sir. James Cooper. And you've been meeting with my daughter for 6 months. Yes, sir. James didn't flinch. I know what you're thinking, but I never asked her for money. I never asked her for anything. I just wanted to be her friend. She deserves to have friends. Friends, Richard repeated. Is that what you are? Charlotte's hand reached up to grip James's, and Richard saw the boy's fingers intertwine with his daughter's without hesitation. We're friends, James said firmly. And if Charlie wants more than that someday, when I've made something of myself, when I could actually offer her a real future, then maybe we can be more. But right now, I'm just a guy who cares about her. A lot. The silence stretched between them. Richard could see James bracing for the rejection, for the order to leave and never come back. He could see Charlotte's eyes filling with tears, preparing to lose the one person who'd made her feel whole again. And Richard thought about the last 3 years, the fortress he'd built around Charlotte, try and protect her from a world that had hurt her, the money he'd thrown at problems that couldn't be solved with money, the loneliness he'd condemned her to in the name of safety. This boy, this poor, earnest, hard-working young man, had given Charlotte something Richard's millions never could. Joy, hope, the feeling that she was valued not despite her disability, but beyond it. Mr. Cooper, Richard said slowly, watching the boy's jaw tighten in anticipation of rejection. When do you finish your shift at the restaurant? James blinked confused. I work Tuesday and Thursday nights, 6 to midnight. Quit. Charlotte gasped. Dad, no, you can't. Richard held up his hand. James, how much do you make at both your jobs combined? I don't want your charity, James said, his voice tight. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. I need someone to work with Charlotte, help her with physical therapy, take her out, show her the world again. Someone who doesn't see her as a patient or victim. Someone who sees her as the remarkable young woman she is. Richard's voice cracked slightly. You've done more for my daughter in 6 months than I've managed in 3 years. I'd be a fool not to recognize that. James shook his head. Sir, I appreciate it, but I'm not taking a pity job. It's not pity. It's recognition. You want to be a physical therapist? I'll pay for your education. Full ride. Any school you want. In exchange, you work with Charlotte 20 hours a week. Real work. I'll pay you what you're making now at both jobs, plus tuition, plus a stipend for books and expenses. Richard stepped closer. And James, when you're not working, when you're just visiting as Charlotte's friend, or whatever you two decide to be, you're welcome in this house. Always. Charlotte was crying now, tears streaming down her face. James looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I don't understand. James finally managed. Why would you do this? Richard looked at his daughter, at the hope blazing in her eyes, at the smile that had been missing for so long. Because for 3 years, I've been trying to buy my daughter's happiness. And you, with nothing but kindness and genuine affection, gave it to her for free. That's not something I can put a price on, but I can show my gratitude. I can invest in the kind of person who walks 3 miles in the rain to keep a promise. James looked down at Charlotte, and Richard saw the unspoken question pass between them. Charlotte nodded, squeezing his hand. Take it, she whispered. Take the chance. Build your dream. I can't let you down, James said, but he was looking at Richard now. If I do this, I'm going to work harder than anyone you've ever met. I'm going to make sure Charlotte gets the best care possible. I'm going to earn every penny. I know you will, Richard said simply. That's why I'm making the offer. James's composure finally cracked. His shoulders shook, and he turned away, trying to hide the tears. Charlotte reached up and pulled him down to her level, holding him as he cried. This strong young man who'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for so long. You can rest now, Charlotte told him softly. You can breathe. We've got you. Richard watched them together and felt the walls he'd built around his own heart begin to crumble. He'd spent so many years believing that money and success were the measures of a man. But standing here, watching this boy who had so little give so much, Richard understood that he'd been wrong. Wealth wasn't about what you had. It was about what you were willing to give. It was about seeing the value in people that others overlooked. It was about having the courage to show up, even when showing up meant walking 3 miles in the rain. Over the next 6 months, James became a fixture in the Harrison household. He started classes at the community college in January, studying physical therapy with a dedication that impressed even his professors. And true to his word, he worked with Charlotte every single day they'd agreed upon, helping her regain strength, pushing her to try new things, celebrating every small victory as if it were monumental. But more than that, he brought life back to the estate, the house that had been silent and sad for so long filled with laughter again. James brought his textbooks and studied at the kitchen table, while Charlotte did her online coursework beside him. They argued about music and movies, cooked terrible experiments in the kitchen that made the household staff laugh. And yes, they danced. Every week, James would put on music and lift Charlotte from her wheelchair, and they would move together to songs that spoke of hope and joy and love. And Richard, watching from the doorway he'd once stood in as a spy, would find himself smiling. Charlotte began physical therapy with a specialist James had recommended, someone who shared his philosophy that disability wasn't an ability. She started going out again, first to the library where she and James had met, then to the park, then to movies and museums and all the places she denied herself. The wheelchair, she discovered, didn't define her. It was simply how she moved through a world that was still fully hers to experience. And James bloomed under the opportunity he'd been given. His grades were exceptional. His professors talked about him as one of the most promising students they'd seen in years. He worked part-time at a physical therapy clinic near campus, absorbing everything he could learn, building toward his dream with every hour of study and practice. Richard and James developed an unexpected friendship. The older man found himself genuinely interested in the younger man's perspective, his fresh eyes on the world, his unwavering belief that people were fundamentally good if you gave them a chance to be. James, in turn, seemed to see past Richard's wealth to the lonely father underneath, the man who tried so hard to protect his daughter that he'd nearly imprisoned her instead. One evening, nearly a year after that rainy November night, Richard found James and Charlotte in the garden. They weren't dancing this time. They were simply sitting together, Charlotte in her wheelchair, James on the bench beside her, their hands intertwined, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Richard started to turn away, to give them privacy, but Charlotte called out to him, "Dad, come sit with us." So Richard did, settling on Charlotte's other side, the three of them watching the day end in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Charlotte said eventually, "about next year. James will be finishing his associate's degree. Top of his class," Richard said proudly, and James ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "I want to go to college too," Charlotte continued. "Real college. On campus. I want to study psychology. I want to help people the way James helped me. The way you both helped me." Richard felt his throat tighten. "You can study anything you want, sweetheart. Anywhere you want." "I was thinking maybe the same school as James," Charlotte said, glancing at the young man beside her with a look that made Richard's heart ache with its tenderness. "If that's okay with both of you." James turned to Richard, and in that moment, Richard saw the question the young man was really asking. Not just about college, but about the future. About what came next for him and Charlotte. About whether Richard would accept something more than friendship between them. Richard looked at his daughter, radiant and alive and so clearly in love. He looked at James, who'd proven over a year that his character was worth more than any fortune. And Richard smiled. "I think," he said slowly, "that sounds like an excellent plan." Charlotte let out a squeal of joy and reached for her father, hugging him tightly. Over her shoulder, Richard met James's eyes and saw gratitude and relief and love shining there. "Thank you." James mouthed silently. Richard nodded. "No, thank you," he thought. "Thank you for seeing my daughter when I was too blind. Thank you for reminding me what really matters. Thank you for being exactly who you are." The three of them sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon. The millionaire, the poor boy who was poor no longer, and the young woman who'd found her way back to life. Money couldn't buy happiness. Richard had learned. But love, genuine connection, and the courage to see beyond circumstances, those were treasures beyond any price. And in that garden, on that perfect evening, Richard Harrison finally understood what it meant to be truly wealthy.